Let me start with a quote that you'll hear me say from time to time. The Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you. Our distance from the original audience of the Bible is something that we're going to think about and be keeping in mind as we look at geography, culture, and history of the world that ancient Israel lived in. So let's say that your friend invites you to a movie and you ask what it's about. She starts to tell you the plot line, and here it is. There's a girl who's living in a small town in Montana, but she decides to sell most of her stuff, pack up her belongings in her car, and move out to Los Angeles. Okay, now let's switch a couple of details in our hypothetical movie. You ask your friend what the movie's about, and she says, there's this girl living in Los Angeles, but she decides to sell most of her stuff, pack up her belongings in her car, and move out to a small town in Montana. And you can probably guess the storyline of each of these movies, right? The first one is probably going to involve the main character searching for fame, taking jobs, waiting tables until she lands a role in a movie and becomes famous. And the second one will probably involve a horse and a girl who returns home, remembers her roots, gets back to nature or what matters in life. And how could you intuitively know all of that? Well, because you know movies and you know American geography and culture. Even if you've never been to Los Angeles, you can picture it because you have this cultural knowledge that you access without even thinking about it. You might never have been to Montana, but when I say small town, you can picture one of those too. A difficulty for us when we're reading the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, is that it is full of cultural, geographic, and historical references that are completely lost on us. The original readers would have picked those up, just as you could in the movie example, without even thinking. But since we don't understand them, we tend to just ignore them. So let me give you an example. In Genesis 11:31, you'll find this. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife. And they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. Now, what kind of story is this going to be? Is it going to be the small town in Montana to Los Angeles kind? Or is it going to be the Los Angeles to the small town in Montana kind? Well, it's not either exactly, but it's more like the LA to Montana story, in that Ur of the Chaldeans was a major city in the ancient Near East, and Canaan was not. And for a number of reasons, not many people live there. So let's look at a map. This is a map of the ancient Near East, or ANE for short. You'll see that abbreviation in a lot of our class materials. So this area is modern day Northeast Africa, the modern day Middle East, and Western Asia. And this is the part of the world where the biblical story occurred. The vast majority of the story that you read in the Old Testament took place in a very small area of land, referred to today as Syria, Palestine. In the biblical text, it's the land of Canaan, and later, after the people of Israel moved there, it was called Israel. So I've put this larger map on the screen to help you visualize actually how small this area Israel really was and is. It's highlighted in red there. For comparison's sake, Israel is about the size of New Jersey. All right, let's go back to our map of the ancient Near East. You can think in terms of 3 zones or areas when you think of this part of the world. There's Syria, Palestine, that orange shaded, the smaller oval there. The other 2 are Egypt and Mesopotamia. So the earliest civilizations in this part of the world were in Egypt and Mesopotamia. These areas rose up with major cities and developed writing systems and built palaces and temples long before the Israelites existed as a people, and long before anything like this was built in the land that would later be called Israel. Now, why do you think that is? Well, for Egypt, the answer is the Nile. In a long time before modern irrigation, there needed to be water in order for plant, animal, and human life to be sustained. Notice all that green in the video right by the riverbanks, but then in the distance you also see in the background sand and a desert-like environment. It was the river that made growing crops and living communities possible. Now, in Mesopotamia, the reason civilization could develop was actually the same. There, it was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that led to a flourishing civilization. In fact, the name of the area, Mesopotamia, actually literally means between two rivers. Now, the earliest civilization in Mesopotamia was called Sumeria. And the people there were the Sumerians. Sumerian is the first written language that we know of. The oldest records of the written language date to about 3300 BC. If you've heard of or read the Epic of Gilgamesh, then you might recognize the name of the legendary figure Gilgamesh, who's thought to have been born in Uruk, the oldest city in Sumeria, in 2700 BC. And if you remember back to our reading of Genesis 11:31 and the trip Terah took with his son Abram, who later becomes Abraham, who is one of the main characters of the Old Testament, they leave Ur of the Chaldeans, and this is Ur here in Samaria. All right, within Mesopotamia, you need to know the Sumerians, but there are two more nations that you need to be able to recognize the names of. The Sumerian Empire was later conquered by the Assyrians, and they were later conquered by the Babylonians. And these two empires, Assyria and Babylon, end up being major characters in the biblical story of the Old Testament, so we've got to know these names. Okay, so Ur is one of the oldest major cities, but if you remember, I said not a lot of people lived in this land of Canaan where Abraham's family was headed. So let's go back and look closer at that zone I called Syria-Palestine in the beginning. The reason it was sparsely populated was because there is no major body of water there. The area right along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea would have been habitable. And then there would have been some much smaller rivers in Canaan that would have provided water, like the Jordan River. But the Jordan is incomparably smaller than the Nile. The Jordan is even more like a shallow creek in some places. So much of ancient Canaan, ancient Israel, looked like this. It was mostly mountains and hills. In some areas, farming would be possible. And in some areas, people would end up using a system called terracing to grow crops. All right, so if this is the case, if it was so difficult to sustain life in this comparably small area of land when we think about Egypt or Mesopotamia, then why did Terah begin to move his family there? And why, when they ended up settling in Haran instead, did God come to Abraham personally and tell him to leave his family and go to the land of Canaan? And why did Canaan, later Israel, end up being such an important location? Well, these ancient empires were located along major bodies of water ended up needing and wanting to travel for two main reasons, okay? The first was trade. If you lived in an area where you grew plenty of wheat, but you couldn't grow olives or grapes, you might want to travel and trade these products with another community. There's evidence that pottery, metals, jewels, all sorts of things were traded at this time. Okay, the second was war. Empires did what empires do. They want to expand their territories and control more land. And they especially wanted to control trade routes. So let's look at some of the trade routes by land on this map. Okay, so here you see these trade routes with these red arrows. And now what about water routes accessing each other's land by water? Okay, now these are on the screen with the blue arrows. Now you see where these land travel routes and waterway travel routes are pointed. What you're seeing is that in order to travel from one place to another, an ancient Near Eastern person would have had to travel through the land of Israel. This area where these ancient civilizations were located It's also referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It's fertile because the water makes life possible, and it's a crescent shape. So an army couldn't march straight from Egypt to Mesopotamia as the crow flies because of the Arabian desert. They didn't have the capability to travel through 500 miles of desert and actually survive that trip at the time. And so that's why Israel is often referred to as a land bridge. Here you see a 16th century map that illustrates the idea. So the small circle in the middle, it says Jerusalem at the bottom. This is representing Jerusalem or Israel. And the map is showing how this small area of Israel actually connects 3 large continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. To get from one of these nations to the other, you've got to travel through Israel. Okay, we will talk about this more when we get to our next discussion on the history at this time period, but I want to say that on one level, so on the secular level or purely political level, the story of Israel in the Bible is the story of 3 major empires, Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, fighting to control this little piece of land that the Israelites inhabited. These empires were constantly attempting to take control of this land so that they could expand their territories and conquer each other. And when we get to the book of Kings, we will actually read all about this, how, spoiler alert, Assyria ends up destroying the northern part of Israel, and then later Babylon conquers Assyria, and then Babylon and Egypt are at war, and Israel decides to pledge their allegiance to Egypt because they think Egypt is going to win this battle of empires, but they choose the wrong side, and Babylon destroys Israel, so that things are never the same.